History as it happens, June 9th, 2022. Choosing war.
Tonight, Americans and Asians are dying for a world where each people may choose its own path to change.
What's at stake here are the principles that the United States and the United Nations and across the world stand for. It's about freedom. It's about the right of people to determine their own future. It's about making sure Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin.
The war in Ukraine has passed the 100-day mark, and it'll likely drag on for months. There is no end in sight. The diplomats are invisible. Russia remains hell-bent on victory. Ukraine refuses to cede any territory to the aggressor. And billions in U.S. aid and arms continue to pour in to help the Ukrainians maintain their independence. Russia chose war. Did the U.S. have any choice but to respond? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Why must this nation hazard its ease and its interest and its power for the sake of a people so far away?
The world is united in our support for Ukraine and our determination to make Putin pay a very heavy price.
I don't think the United States is making a mistake, but I think the United States has some big choices coming before it. I think we're in a situation now where we have committed ourselves to defending a country that is crucial for the future of European security, and a country that has been attacked by a long-standing adversary, but we haven't thought through what the next steps are.
On April 7, 1965, a month after sending 3,500 Marines to secure an airbase at Da Nang in South Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson delivered a speech at Johns Hopkins University. He explained the U.S. mission in that faraway land in language any generation of Americans post-1945 can relate to.
The contest in Vietnam is part of a wider pattern of aggressive purposes. Why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam? We are there because we have a promise to keep. Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
In that speech and many others, Johnson spoke of the importance of upholding U.S. credibility. Our allies had to know our word meant something. We would defend freedom from communist aggression. We would maintain a world order in which national sovereignty was supposed to be sacrosanct. American leaders have played variations on this theme for decades, all based on the same premise. U.S. global leadership is indispensable. A full year before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2021, President Biden was talking about restoring American stature in a global struggle not against communism, as it was in LBJ's time, or against terrorism, as it was after 9/11, but against our new global nemesis, autocracy.
America's back. So let's get together and demonstrate to our great-great-grandchildren when they read about us that democracy functions and works, and together there's nothing we can't do.
There is a pattern in recent U.S. history. Humiliating defeats fueled a need for national rejuvenation, usually through violence. Thus, the Vietnam Syndrome was cured by the Gulf War in 1991. The shattering sense of insecurity and vulnerability felt after 9/11 would be dealt with by waging global war on anyone who might threaten us, which in turn led to another humiliation years in the making, Afghanistan.
13 heroes gave their lives. I was just at Dover Air Force Base for the dignified transfer. We owe them and their families a debt of gratitude we can never repay, but we should never, ever, ever forget.
So let's consider what's happening today. U.S. leaders, intellectuals, defense contractors, journalists view the war in Ukraine as the next opportunity for American renewal. Now, Russia chose war. Vladimir Putin ordered his armies to invade his neighbor. There was no justification for it. And as for Putin's motivations, the history of NATO expansion, the complexities of Ukrainian-Russian relations, Putin's historical distortions, we're not really going to get into those issues in this episode. I'd refer you to my recent episodes. If you scroll back to early March, you'll find plenty to listen to. Today, we're going to talk about U.S. choices to make Ukraine a strategic partner, to borrow some jargon, to send Ukraine, before this war began, more than $7 billion in security assistance since 2014, the year Russia annexed Crimea.
We sent Ukraine more security assistance last year, $650 million in weapons, including anti-air and anti-armor equipment, before the invasion. More than we had ever provided before.
The title for this episode comes from a book written by Frederick Logeval about the Johnson administration's decision to escalate the war in Vietnam in 1965. Logeval describes that moment when the Marines arrived in Da Nang as a time when all informed observers knew a line had been crossed. From that point on, it would be so much harder to de-escalate, to get out. Not impossible, indeed withdrawal would become the only way out of that morass, but still very difficult once the line had been crossed. We have crossed that line in U.S. involvement in Ukraine. And some would argue that the U.S. really had no choice but to supply the Ukrainians, and many of those voices are now calling for global war against autocracy. Well, my own position, I'm struggling with it because of the dangers inherent in more escalation. There is no debate in Congress about how this is going to end or when it might end. Now, some Americans are at the other end of this spectrum, as Trump-endorsed U.S. Senate candidate J.D. Vance told a reporter in March.
I think we can only focus on so many things at once, and instead of being distracted by what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, we should be worried about the safety and security of our own people. And so our leaders should focus on our own border, not the Ukrainian border, not the Russian border. Let those people 6,000 miles away deal with that.
You might call Vance's stance isolationism. What happens in Ukraine is none of our business. So there's got to be a sane middle here, somewhere between open-ended support for Ukraine, a nation whose independence has become America's responsibility, although, as President Obama put it in 2016, Ukraine is not a core American interest, but it is a Russian one. Somewhere between blank check support on the one hand and to hell with Ukraine on the other. Because some people are now raising questions that can't be ignored any longer. Ian Bremmer writing, Russia is not getting routed anytime soon, and the West is only able and willing to do so much more than it already has in support of Ukraine. Bremmer says Western leaders won't tolerate unlimited pain and risk to support Ukraine. The longer the war continues and Russia hangs on, the more likely it is those limits will be exposed, especially as the U.S. gets closer to midterm elections and winter threatens European homes with soaring energy costs. Bremmer goes on to say debates will shift from how best to help Ukraine win to whether Ukraine can actually win and what their endgame should be. So let's try to make sense of all of this now with two of my favorite guests. Jeffrey Engel is founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is the author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. And Jeremi Suri, historian at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He has a new book coming out this fall, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back.
Always good to talk to you.
And Jeremi Suri, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Martin.
Good to see you both again. You're both used to my meandering interview style by now, but instead of walking through a maze to get to the point, I'm going to get right to it. Jeremi Suri, I'll start with you. Is the United States making a mistake? If so, what is it?
I don't think the United States is making a mistake, but I think the United States has some big choices coming before it. I think we're in a situation now where we have committed ourselves to defending a country that is crucial for the future of European security and a country that has been attacked by a long-standing adversary. But we haven't thought through what the next steps are. And if history teaches us anything, doing the right thing today opens up many challenges for tomorrow. And that's the space we're in right now.
I think Jeremy, as always, is spot on. I think the United States has done, and this administration, I should say, has done a tremendous job in this crisis. If I had to give it a grade, I would give it probably A minus, B plus, and only because I would like them to still work harder for the final grade. It's hard pressed to think of what we could have done that would have averted this crisis, because it's not a crisis necessarily of our own making, in my opinion. And by the same token, I think Jeremy's, again, exactly right that we have made a series of important, useful, strategic choices, many of which I think have happened largely behind the scenes in terms of shoring up the support of our allies and NATO in particular. And now we've raised the specter of different problems than we were expecting. If when the invasion first occurred in February, if we had said, 100 days from now, we're going to be talking about how far Ukraine is going to push back against the Russians, I think we would have all been thrilled with that conversation. But now here we are, and there are some strategic questions that have arisen from the way the war has manifested itself thus far.
Jeremy, I want to take issue with one thing you said. Engel, I have some problems with your answer as well, but I'll go with Jeremy first here. You said security of Ukraine is critical to the security of Europe. Are you implying that if Russia should prevail in Ukraine, that it could potentially threaten other countries in Eastern Europe?
Well, I'm not making an argument about a domino theory per se. We've learned the perils of those sorts of presumptions. What I am arguing, though, is that Ukraine borders a number of very important allies for the United States and for all of our more traditional West European allies. These countries, their security is fundamental to NATO. It is fundamental to the way we think about Europe. And having an aggressive Russia that has just swallowed up or tried to swallow up a border country to them, a country that's also the source of food for much of the world, a source of energy as well, that imperils their security. It would be as if we had an adversary taking part of Canada. And so it is crucial that Ukraine is not a beachhead for Russian aggression for our allies and for our interests in European security.
It should be needless to say, but my view is not that the United States is responsible for what's happening here, as some scholars have said, John Mearsheimer. This is Russia's war. It's a war of aggression, but questioning U.S. foreign policy does not make me pro-Putin. Jeffrey Engel, to your point, I don't want to get into another huge NATO debate. However, for years now, there have been warnings about the U.S. pushing too hard for Ukraine's entry into NATO, even though Western leaders have known for some time now that Ukraine was not going to join NATO. So this vague offer has been dangling out there for some time. I mean, Ukraine even joined NATO's Partnership for Peace way back in 1994. So I'm not sure I agree with you when you say there is nothing really from a U.S. point of view that might have been done to avert this crisis.
Well, I think the United States, frankly, did everything that it could and more in order to tell the world that this invasion was coming. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that people have to be responsible for their actions and nations have to take ownership of their actions. And the United States and its allies, I would argue, in this conflict, whatever strategic mistakes you might want to say, and I actually don't think there were many, but whatever strategic quibbles, shall we say, that there were with the way the United States approached Russia at the end of the Cold War, one side here decided to invade another sovereign state. And by the way, that's a sovereign state that the Russians had promised territorial integrity to in the 90s when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So, I have to say that the argument that the United States and its allies, by expanding NATO, caused this reaction, I think puts agency in the wrong place. And I'm hesitant to use this example, but it's the one that keeps running through my mind. So don't pick at me with the quibbles of it. But I think the idea in saying that the United States and its allies, by extending their security alliances to countries that wanted to join, prompted an invasion, is similar to saying, well, he or she was dressed provocatively, so therefore we should excuse the rapist. I mean, the truth is the United States and its allies were doing what countries do under the UN Charter, which is make strategic alliances based upon their own defensive needs. And one side chose to cross the border, and that was Vladimir Putin in this case. So I'm perfectly happy analyzing and doing an autopsy on how we expanded NATO, but let's not have that replace the conversation of who actually is to blame for this conflict. I'm very frustrated by that argument that's being made out in the public by Mearsheimer, and to a lesser extent, I think, by our good friend Mary Sarati, that the United States made strategic errors that forced Putin's hand. Again, I come back to my awful analogy that we need to remember who is actually the person who is committing a crime here.
To use the title of this podcast, Russia chose war. Jeremi, Suri, you have anything to add about what Mr. Engel just said?
As always, I agree with Jeff, and I would simply add to what he said that we shouldn't leave out the countries in the region that very strongly wanted NATO membership and had very good reason to want NATO membership. If any of us were sitting in Poland in 2000, or earlier in 1993, 1994, we would want NATO membership, knowing the history of both Russian and German aggression. And right now, I think the Poles and others have indicated on NATO expansion. And so it's not just an American and a Russian choice either. And how can you run an alliance for European security if you then say you're going to give Russia a veto over that alliance? So none of this is to say that we couldn't have handled things better. Of course, our diplomacy could have been better, but you shouldn't blame the victim of the aggression for the aggression.
So we can't undo the past. We're in this situation today in the United States. The citizenry has a right to question which way we're going in this war that has no end in sight. There's been almost no debate in Congress or the mainstream editorial pages, or really anywhere, about why the U.S. became the de facto guarantor of Ukraine's independence to the tune of $53 billion in aid, as well as sanctions on Russia that are having a ripple effect through the global economy. By the way, $53 billion is about 80% of Russia's annual defense budget, just to put that figure into some perspective. The U.S. has chosen proxy war against Russia, and we don't know how long this is going to last. I guess that's what's really bugging me here.
Well, I would just simply say, Martin, if I might, that Congress has had every opportunity to debate this, and they should. So Congress, as you said, has approved across party lines an aid package to Ukraine that's about the same amount of money we were spending in Afghanistan year in and year out. Of course, in Afghanistan, we had soldiers on the ground. We don't in Ukraine, and the president has said we won't have soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. But Congress could have had hearings if they wanted on that package. They could have had a serious discussion. Members of Congress don't want to do that. That's part of the problem. And so I think we should make sure we separate these two issues. There's the question of whether we're doing the right thing or not, and that's what we've started to talk about. Then there's also the question about how we bring the public into this discussion. And I think that President Biden has tried to some extent. He published a major editorial in yesterday's New York Times. Yeah. He has given a number of speeches on this. And I think we're in a situation we've been in many times before since the Korean War, really, which is where members of Congress would rather leave this decision to the president. And then, depending on how it turns out, either take credit or criticize the president for that. But that's Congress's decision.
Yeah, that's a problem historically. Jeffrey Engel. Congress has abdicated its responsibility for foreign policy and for war making. The United States hasn't declared war on another country since, I think, 1943. A lot of people listening to this might be surprised to learn that Congress between 1935 and 1940 passed 5 separate neutrality laws to tie the hands of the executive. But now we're living in an age of an imperial presidency. When do you believe this shift started to happen, and why?
I think the shift started happening, frankly, under Theodore Roosevelt. Presidents took more and more executive authority. And of course, we know from Franklin Roosevelt, from Lyndon Johnson, from George W. Bush, that anytime a president is not restrained, he or she will continue to act as they wish. So this is a long-term trend. But I would actually disagree ever so slightly, in a polite way, with your characterization of how Congress has been involved here. I think there hasn't been a great, wild congressional debate on the floor of the House or Senate or in hearings, because by and large, everyone agrees that something should be done. Everyone agrees that aid should be given. I think where we might delve a little deeper and say, and this reinforces Jeremy's point, that Congress has decided that we all want to help Ukraine. This is helping a country that is in our best interest at this point to help, and not least because it is suffering from an aggressive war and including war crimes. Where we can start to argue, I think, is the way that Congress has allowed the administration to dictate how our aid should be given. So I'm enthusiastic about aid to Ukraine. I'm actually quite hesitant about the level of armaments that we have been increasingly shipping to the Ukrainians. President Biden is, in the aforementioned op-ed, made the point that we are sending now new long-range artillery.
It's getting ridiculous because each time these new, more powerful weapons fail to win the war, right, or turn the tide of the war, it invites more escalation. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
I hate to say this, but let's not let the perfect be enemy of the good here, that this is a real hard problem. And the administration is trying to figure out what level of armaments are necessary in order to continue to retard Russian advances without giving the opportunity to the Ukrainians, giving too much agency to the Ukrainians to escalate the war on their own. So go back to the rocket system that was just delivered to the Ukrainians or just promised to Ukrainians. You know, this thing has a range of 50 miles with the missiles that they're giving it and 200 miles with missiles that we haven't authorized yet. Well, the Ukrainians have promised that they're not going to shoot over the Russian border. Okay, I believe them until I see them do it. And they have an interest in not violating the United States. But if I was the president of Ukraine and I saw convoys massing on the other side of the border to reinforce troops that were already engaged, I would be mighty tempted to say that's a fictional line on the map, according to Vladimir Putin. So let's follow that logic. Now, I have to say, this is the exact same way that we got involved in Cambodia and in Laos in the Vietnam War.
Wars escalate.
Wars do escalate, and that's a real concern. But the fact that wars escalate doesn't mean we should do nothing.
Well, the issue is, how did Ukraine become, we've covered this a little bit already, but we can return to it. And Jeremy, you can offer your thoughts on what I'm about to say here. How did Ukraine become such an important U.S. ally? We chose this path. It wasn't an accident. Ted Galen Carpenter, writing for the Cato Institute, a non-interventionist libertarian think tank, wrote that the United States made Ukraine an ally knowing full well that it would antagonize Russia. He says Washington's growing political and military ties with Ukraine epitomize an especially reckless policy.
But they are also an aspiring democracy and an aspiring trade partner with the rest of Europe. Just because the Russians claim with historical dubiousness, if you're arguing over what happened in 1320 or 1512,
or 1994,
that's a fine argument, but it doesn't give you the right, in my opinion, to invade another country. So again, we did not make the choice to make Ukraine a strategic ally and an interest of the United States. We made the broader choice, which I would argue goes back all the way to George Kennan, which I'd love to discuss more of, to say that democracies themselves, especially in vital areas like Europe, need to be defended from aggressive war. I don't find particular difficulty with that formulation.
Jeremy, I know you want to respond, but whenever Jeffrey Engel mentions George Kennan in this context, I always have to remind him that George Kennan was against Ukraine joining NATO.
Well, there's a lot to say here.
Take your time. We got all day.
I think one thing we should focus on is the way this has played out in the last 4 to 6 months. The United States in 2014 made the choice that Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine, was not a vital interest that we were going to fight over. We refused to recognize, as most of the international community did, Russia's invasion of Crimea as legitimate. But we took no military action and really quite minimal economic sanctions as a consequence of that. This was different, and I think this was different, and here I'm going into Jeff's territory, because I think it evoked some of the same reactions by Americans as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. The nakedness of this aggression, the flagrance of it, the ways in which Putin appeared not only to be continuing his efforts to pull off pieces of the Donbas of eastern Ukraine that actually have large Russian-speaking and Russian-sympathetic populations, but actually to take all of Ukraine and to take it in one fell swoop in a kind of invasion that is seen in and of itself as threatening to the international order. And I think that is as important in understanding the train of events that have followed as anything else that we've talked about. If Vladimir Putin had invaded Ukraine in a less obvious way, if he had done what I thought he was going to do, which is try to lop off the eastern provinces, which is what I think he's now trying to do after failing to take all of Ukraine, I think the American and certainly the German reaction would have been very different.
Yeah, I think you're right about that their war aims have changed for the moment.
But I think the key point here for our discussion is that when the United States and American presidents in particular make questions about getting involved in a war or not, it's not simply the territory that's been invaded, but also how it has been invaded that matters. That was true in Korea, that was true in Kuwait, and I think it's very true right now.
I think it's important also, and this is just, I wish I had said it as eloquently as Jeremy just did, but this is important to remember what our allies are doing too, because in 2003, most of our allies said, you guys are heading in the wrong direction. And by the way, they were right. In this case, our allies have enthusiastically said, we want collective security. We want help. If other people who share the same values as us are saying, we all should be scared, that reaffirms our sense of the nature of the problem. And we're dealing with Europeans and Germans in particular, who have a particular aversion to hawkishness and a lot more economic ties with Russia than we do. So if the cost for the Germans of supporting the Ukrainians is higher than we are paying, the economic cost, and if the fact that we are typically considered the hawkish cowboys in this alliance, and we are the ones who are not pushing others into collective security, but rather we are joining the pack, again, I think that's a reaffirmation of what Jeremy was saying, that if people around the world are viewing this as a fundamental threat to the international order.
I don't know if it is. So Jeremy brought up your book, When the World Seemed New, and the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam's Iraq. Jeffrey, one of the great revelations in your scholarship in that book was that when that invasion happened back in 1990, 1991, the initial response inside the Bush administration was, by people like Dick Cheney, other hawks, it was, what does it matter if there's a Kuwaiti flag or an Iraqi flag on a barrel of oil? But then the conflict was made into something more, not a regional or local dispute, just like the war in Ukraine is now being made into something more. The Fred Kagans, the Ann Applebaums, the Jeffrey Engels of the world are talking about democracy versus autocracy, and I am tired of that framing.
Well, first, in Insider Baseball, the document that revealed that conversation was, I think, maybe the only document in my 30 plus years of being a professional historian that I found classified and should have been classified because of the nature of that conversation. That American policymakers in the first days after Saddam Hussein invaded were more than willing to throw Kuwait over the side because they didn't care about Kuwait. But then again, the broader issues come to mind, especially in a new period of formation of international order as the end of the Cold War was.
Yeah, the New World Order, which sounds conspiratorial, but it wasn't. There was an opportunity there.
Well, and the opportunity was, and I would argue, to go back to Franklin Roosevelt's vision of how the United States should work and how collective security should work under the United Nations, which the Cold War in many ways had interrupted. So I think we're actually seeing the same debate here. I mean, I'm equally uncomfortable as you with the broad autocracy versus democracy debate, largely because I think the advocates of that oftentimes overpraise democracy and give democracy credit when it does aggressive things in the world. Again, see invasion of Iraq in 2003. So I don't like necessarily the bedfellows I am in with this argument.
Yeah, I don't want to put you in the same category as Fred Kagan, sorry.
Well, no, I mean,
Or is it Robert Kagan? I'm getting them confused.
My broader point is that people can have a variety of reasons for coming to the same conclusion. And I am concerned about Vladimir Putin, and I am concerned about aggressive war. And I'm also concerned about the rise of autocracy, by the way, in the United States as well. And this is a moment where I think we are making strategic choices that we don't want to make. We don't want to have this discussion. This is not a conflict, I would argue, that the United States has sought out with Russia. Biden would really not like to be having these conversations and giving those speeches and writing those op-eds. But sadly, and here I have to sound a little bit like Mearsheimer, we do have to engage the world that is presented to us.
And so I agree with a lot of that. And I also agree, Martin, with what you said about escaping the seductive frame of democracy versus autocracy. Let's be honest, Ukraine is at best an aspiring democracy.
Yes.
Zelensky was a largely failed president until this war started. And the Ukrainian government is filled with unsavory characters.
And the parliament has oligarchs, or the members of parliament answer to oligarchs.
Right. I think what this war is about, fundamentally, is it's about a long train of aggression committed by the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, including interfering in our own democracy in the United States. And the threat to the United States, to be very specific about this, is that Putin's behavior time and again has been more and more infringing upon core interests of our own, such as fair elections at home without foreign intervention, such as intervening in one of the core areas of our international security, which is the security of Western Europe, such as access to energy around the world. And so I think this is very much about national interests. As is always the case, you find yourself in the war, as Jeff said so well, that's not the war you wanted to fight. But it is not the wrong set of interests that are motivating us here, and I think it has very little to do with democracy abroad. It has much more to do with democracy at home in the United States.
By the way, it was Robert Kagan who I meant to say, not Fred Kagan, but I think both of them fall into the neoconservative category, if I'm not mistaken. So I wanted to share this in my preamble before the interview, but I will share it with the listeners while I'm sharing it with both of you. Frederick Logevall's Choosing War, about the choice to go to war in Vietnam. When the first contingent of American Marines waded ashore near Da Nang in South Vietnam in the early part of March 1965, it signaled the end of the most important period of policy deliberation in the history of American involvement in Vietnam. The period began some 18 months earlier in the summer of 1963 when Kennedy was president. Logevall goes on to say it was characterized by marked deterioration in the politico-military position of the Saigon government and a concomitant dilemma for Washington officials whether to escalate dramatically U.S. involvement in the war or get out of it altogether. The landing of the Marines and the initiation of regular sustained bombing of North Vietnam were dramatic proof of which way they had gone. But here is the key part as I read from Fred's book. That the significance of this development is clearer in hindsight than it was at the time cannot be doubted. The question is how much clearer. Neither senior officials nor anyone else could know in the late winter of '65 how large the American commitment would eventually become, or how long the war would go on, how much blood would be shed before it was over. Are we thinking about these questions now here in the United States with Ukraine in a year or 6 months or 18 months? How many more Ukrainians will have died without any resolution to the conflict?
Well, I think that is what the Biden administration is struggling with, and I think that's where, as we said earlier, I think questions arise. They are trying to be very careful about delimiting how force sent by the United States is used. And I think Jeff referred to this before, the determination that our rockets should not be fired at a distance that would actually hit Russian territory and things of that sort. We've been careful, as Biden was in his editorial yesterday, to say that this is not a war against Russia. So we are trying to set limits to prevent this from escalating.
Does Russia agree with that?
Of course they don't. Of course, well, they don't publicly. What Putin actually, whether he catches and recognizes these signals is another story. We don't know. Certainly the Russians are claiming, as they would, of course, anything the United States does to help Ukraine is an attack on Russia. That's their claim. Whether they really believe that is another story. But this is what's really difficult, and the Biden administration is struggling with this. How do you plan for a future, as Clausewitz tells us in any war, that you can't predict? And how do you support one side without going to war with the other side? But we don't have a choice of not supporting that one side that we're supporting. So how do you do that? We've tried to give clear signals as to the limits of what we are willing to do. We are not going to put our forces on the ground. We are not going to give weapons that are directly used with our consent to attack Russian territory.
No-fly zone.
We need to do. No-fly zone, right? I think the real question is, what does victory look like?
Weakening Russia. That is not a war aim. How do you define that?
Okay, and along those lines, what is the role for diplomacy? Right? Where should we be in our negotiations? I believe that we should be doing everything we can to provide the Russians a face-saving way out. This is just classic Sun Tzu, right? Give your enemy a golden bridge out. Don't corner your enemy. What can we do that will help Putin spin this as a victory as he leaves? Is that possible? Probably not right now. We cannot force the Ukrainians to give up territory that they don't want to give up. that would defeat the whole purpose here. But how could we not make this a black eye for Putin and encourage him to leave and allow him, at least for his own domestic constituency, to claim this as a victory? That's where I think our diplomatic space should be right now.
So, Jeffrey, before you jump in, Jeremy, what you described there was, Lyndon Johnson, 1965, escalating without escalating. From our point of view, we're not escalating the war.
Yes and no. I think those around President Biden now are thinking about that exact historical analogy. They are thinking about that. They know a lot about that. They're hearing about it from those of us who are historians who write about this and talk to certain people, right? So they are thinking about that. As Jeffrey said before, though, what you do is still really hard. So they are trying not to escalate in a thoughtless way. They're trying to set limits. They're trying to set clear aims for their escalation. But you have a lot of complicated actors here. And figuring out where the space is for diplomacy is really hard for two reasons. Vladimir Putin is saying he will only leave if he gets what he wants. And Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine now, is in a position where his legitimacy is based on not giving up 1 inch of territory. I agree with you. We should be pursuing every avenue. We should be talking in every way that we can. But at some level, we have to wait for there to be an opening on the ground, for the Russians to face another defeat, or for the Ukrainians to pare back their own aims in this conflict.
Because there's always a choice. But at this point, the administration probably believes it has no choice but to continue to assist Ukraine. If there were a moment when it would have been easier not to go all in here, well, that moment is past.
It's a history podcast, so let's go back into the history.
Yes.
I think one of the lessons I take from Fred Logevall's book, which is beyond the best one on this subject, is that the Johnson administration was hearing from critics within the administration and outside the administration, critics in Congress, who from the very beginning, before that decision to Americanize the war in 65, were saying this is not going to work and that this is not actually going to be a solution and that more is going to be required and we don't know where that's going. Now, we don't yet have the conversations and the documents to know that the Biden administration is hearing the same thing in Ukraine, but that's certainly not the conversation, at least that we're seeing in public, which is to say the fault of the Johnson administration in Vietnam was that they bet on a losing horse and didn't actually think that they were going to be able to make it win, and yet they did it anyway. Here, the administration, I think, is actually being very judicious in how it's titrating its aid. And again, I want to be careful to say that I'm concerned that we're over titrating at this point, or rather overflowing with aid at this point, because we did not give these advanced weapons systems. We did not give blank checks to the Ukrainians in the first days of the war. We gave them basically the bare minimum that we possibly could in order to hope that they survived another week. With every opportunity that they took to demonstrate greater and greater strength, which means greater and greater survivability, we gave them more and more and more aid. So I think in a sense, it's the opposite of what happened in Vietnam, in that we are giving more aid as the prospects for our side appear stronger, unlike in Vietnam, where we gave more aid whenever the prospects for our side looked weaker. And that is, I think, a critical distinction. But let me just be clear. I agree with you on many central points, but this one in particular. I'm really uncomfortable with degrading Russian power as a war aim for the United States right now. I'm happy with that as an ancillary benefit. But I think our war aim right now in Ukraine should not be to weaken the Russians, because that invites further conflict down the line. I think our war aim should be to protect the integrity of Ukraine as the Ukrainians see it.
Well, they want to expel all. Sorry to interrupt you, Jeffrey. I'm doing more interrupting today than I usually do.
That makes for a good conversation.
I'm agitated.
Well, you should be agitated. This is a real problem. I am profoundly worried about where this is going. I find myself wondering, are we in August of 1914?
Well, that's why you don't get involved in these things to begin with. I don't want to go all the way back to the very beginning where we were going over, how did we get here? Did the United States make poor choices? In 2008, but I am going to go there. William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, in 2008, he was the ambassador to Russia. He warned the United States about pushing NATO expansion to Ukraine. He said it would be seen as an act of hostility by the Russians. That was a red line for them. So there were warnings about this. That was not so much a question as it was a word salad. But Jeremy, do you want to?
Well, yeah. So the case that Burns and Fiona Hill made at the time was not that the United States should not support NATO expansion. It was that the United States should not be flip about it. And the criticism was of George W. Bush in particular for just simply announcing in Putin's presence that we supported this without any discussion.
The Bucharest Conference in 2008.
This week, our alliance must also decide how to respond to the request by Georgia and Ukraine to participate in NATO's membership action plan. These two nations inspired the world with their rose and orange revolutions, and now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the membership action plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe. It would send a signal throughout the region that these two nations are and will remain sovereign and independent states. Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
The real issue for us right now is how do we manage an unmanageable situation? I don't think there is a choice where we can avoid being in this complex space that we're in now. The Russians see Ukrainian security as a threat to their aims, a threat to what Putin has defined as the goals for Russia. And Russia's normal behavior now of the last 3 years, going back at least to the war that's being fought as an informal war in eastern Ukraine, has been to try to take part of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians see that obviously across the spectrum in Ukraine as a threat to their sovereignty. So how do we manage this situation? I don't think it's for the United States to stay out. I don't think there is an alternative for the United States to stay out. It's how do we manage the use of influence we have, which is minimal, to try to bring the sides to an end to this conflict. That should be our war aim, to return Ukraine to a sovereign, secure state and to return Russian forces to Russian territory.
I don't know if that's possible at this point.
So can I say I think it is possible? I think it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. I do think the best case scenario is something we have seen repeatedly in history. It's actually something the United States has been forced to experience, which is a long commitment that you realize isn't achieving what you want to achieve, and you pull out. Yeah. Large powers can pull out. We've had to do that in the Middle East repeatedly, the United States, and that will be the lesson for Russia. Whether Vladimir Putin can survive as the leader of Russia in that scenario is a good question, but that's the scenario we're looking for.
Here we're very fortunate in that Vladimir Putin is running an autocratic state with no free media. So it's much easier for him to declare victory and go home than it would be for a country that has a more vigorous public debate.
I just want to say again that if there was a time or a moment where the United States could say, we're not going to get involved in this war, that time has passed. And that would have been a very difficult decision to make, right? February, what is it now? Just already 3-4 months that this war has been going on. Everyone was putting the Ukrainian flag on their, social media avatars. It would have been very hard at that point, especially after basically making Ukraine a member of NATO in all but name, right? In all but signing on the dotted line.
Well, but that all but name is really important. If we had made Ukraine a member of NATO, then our forces would be engaged right now.
Or maybe Russia wouldn't have invaded.
I don't think there was even really, of course there was a choice, but the whole point about choices in the world of international politics, they're choices that are very difficult to make. Yes. Let's remember what happened in February, right? Russia tried to seize the entire country in 2 to 3 days, and all of our allies, particularly those, as Jeffrey said so well, who had been most hesitant to use force, were deeply concerned at a level we have not seen since the early Cold War, and Germany is Exhibit A here. It was impossible, nearly impossible, for any president other than Donald Trump to basically stick his middle finger up at our European allies and say, we don't care. And why would Donald Trump have been able to do that? Because Donald Trump would have opened the door for Putin to do this. As John Bolton's, Donald Trump's own national security advisor, has said, Trump actually was seeking to end NATO's existence. So unless you're for the end of NATO, I don't see how you could not have responded in some forceful way as an American president in February of 2022.
2 quick things before I get to my last issue. Jeremy, thank you for clarifying the William Burns memo from '08 for me. And also, speaking of NATO, my next episode, I'm going to speak to Andrew Bacevich, who has been arguing that the U.S. should have left NATO a long time ago, and that probably would have ended NATO as we know it, to leave European security to the Europeans. So, last issue to discuss here. The other day, Henry Kissinger, I'm not a fan of his. I believe he did help Richard Nixon commit a war crime with the secret bombing of a neutral country during the Vietnam War, Cambodia, which of course was home to part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but still. The other day, Kissinger said, to end this war, there's going to have to be a dirty deal. Those are my words, not his. Ukraine's going to have to give up some territory, cede some territory. You know, Kissinger remembers dirty deals. That's how he finally got the U.S. out of Vietnam after many years of secret negotiations with Le Duc Tho that led to the Paris peace agreements. But back to the present time. Do you agree that for this to end, not 3, 4, 5 years from now with many more thousands of people dead, it's going to have to be Ukraine ceding territory, or is Kissinger jumping the gun?
I think he's completely out of line, and maybe this highly regarded 99-year-old man should not be an authority on these issues any longer.
There's that question too, yes.
You know, it's very easy, and just as we shouldn't sit here in the United States and say our war aim is to weaken another country, we also shouldn't tell other countries to give up their territory. We don't do that. And I don't think that solves this problem at all, because that just creates an irredentist claim within Ukraine that's going to lead to continued fighting. And it's not as if Zelensky can control what those on the ground there want to do. So, no, I think there has to be a deal. But I think the long record of territorial settlements in that part of the world is actually not a very good one. So I'm hesitant to see a Kissingerian deal. Most of those didn't work out too well.
And the alternative, though, is what? Fighting for months, years to expel Russia? I'm sounding like a broken record here. Jeffrey
No,
Engel.
I think you're asking exactly the right questions, and I know that Jeremy and I share your anxieties that we don't know what this future is going to hold either, and a lot of the avenues are not good. But this is actually why I went back to George Kennan, not the Kennan of the late 90s, who, by the way, the reason he opposed NATO expansion was because other people were in favor of it. That's how George Kennan operated. But the George Kennan of 1946, who said, we are at the start of a new geopolitical struggle. We need to set up the parameters of what we think is tenable. That's to say, contain the Soviet Union, don't let them expand. And as he put it, there's going to be a series of shifting geopolitical conflicts, and we don't quite know where that's going to go. And he also said it's going to take a couple generations. So I think the question that I'm wondering about is not necessarily the important one that you're asking, but a secondary important question, which is not how does the conflict in Ukraine end up, where exactly does the line draw? Does it take 2 years or 3 years? But rather, how are we structuring European security at this point for the next 2 generations? And my anticipation is that Ukraine is not the last time we're going to be having this discussion. Yeah. And I hope to God, for the sake of the Ukrainian people and the international system, that the fighting in Ukraine stops. But the bigger questions that we should be asking is not Ukraine. It's how should we be structuring American foreign policy in Europe, and as an example for Asia as well, of where we are willing to tell the world that we are actually willing to put our money where our mouth is, and hopefully just our money, and defend our allies.
See, that's
coming back to this. I was just going to say, if I could, Martin, just because I think Jeffrey's point is spot on. You know, in some ways, the expansion of NATO into Finland and Sweden, which was unthinkable 5 months ago, that could be one of the more enduring outcomes, good or bad, right? Mm-hmm. Jeffrey's point, the Kennan point, is that the structure of security in Europe is changing before our eyes. To your question, Martin, what is the solution? Well, it's thinking about how to create a stable new security structure that includes Russia moving forward. And I don't know what that is, but that's the discussion. And I think that's what Jeffrey's arguing for.
Well, eventually we're going to need Russia as part of the international community. It's just too big. We've got too many natural resources.
You might turn the argument around and say eventually Russia is going to realize it needs to be a part of the international community.
Well, I don't know how rational Mr. Putin is at this moment.
But he won't be the leader of Russia forever either.
It's
I
true.
mean, when one's thinking in the long term, it's not that you can ignore his presence, but we will have a conversation. Hopefully your podcast will be even more popular in 10 years, and we'll be having a conversation about whoever replaces him, who could be worse, by the way, too,
Yes.
not necessarily better.
These are difficult decisions. I hope no one listening thinks I'm, just sitting here in a comfortable studio in Washington, which I am, making it sound so easy. But we're $53 billion into this already from the U.S. taxpayers' point of view. And, there are some folks out there who posit this, and maybe you think it sounds crazy. It is pretty cruel to suggest the following, and of course the Ukrainians don't want to hear it. But if the United States didn't support Ukraine at all, the war would have ended. Well, of course, it would have ended with potential Russian domination of their country, but with less destruction, less people dying. That's not my.
I don't think that's right. I think that's a myth, and I think again,
and that's not my point of view either. But
right.
It's out
I
there.
just wanted, because we're a history podcast. Let's go back to history here, right? Wars of this kind are not dictated and determined by external actors like the United States. So the fighting would have continued. If Putin's plan had worked, he might have been able to set up a puppet government in Kyiv, but you would have had an insurgency in the Ukraine with lots of people dying day in and day out. Whether it would have been more or less than now, I don't know. But the alternative to what we're seeing now is not some peaceful, stable Ukraine with a Russian person in charge.
Any closing thoughts, Jeffrey Engel?
Two, actually. The first is, again, just to reinforce, I think your anxieties I share. I'm very concerned at this point. I'm much more concerned about the international system than I was 12 months ago. So I think that we need to think ever so slightly in Kissingerian terms and realize that a dirty deal actually is sometimes better understood as hard thinking. And we need to, as a country, do what we did in 1946 and after, look at the world and determine which places really matter and which places are more important and which places are greater strategic concerns for us. Here's a good example, again, going back to history, where I would argue our interests in Iraq in 2003 pale in comparison to our interests in Ukraine in 2022, because frankly, Europe is more important and our strategic allies are in Europe, and we have an aggressive country that is on the border of NATO. That's a far different scenario than sending money into Afghanistan or sending money into Iraq. So, to anticipate your conversation with Professor Basevich, and there's nobody I respect more, I agree with him that we need to be judicious over where we send our resources. I just happen to think this is a good investment on our part. The second point, which I would make, and I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I'm going to give some praise for George H.W. Bush's foreign policy.
I already sound like a broken record, but go ahead.
Just play out the thought experiment of how this crisis looks if the United States leaves NATO, or if NATO breaks up at the end of the Cold War, and there is no one on the continent who is able to defend against whatever might happen 30 years later. In this case, a resurgent Russian nationalism. And George Bush was very clear about the fact in 1990, 91, 92, and we know this from his diary as well as his public statements, that he said the reason we need NATO is because our enemy of the future is uncertainty. And I would much rather have us be involved in order to make the decision of whether or not we want to engage than for us to have that decision precluded from us by being absent from the continent. So I actually am rather thrilled, as a person who supports NATO vigorously, I'm rather thrilled that we can have this conversation and not the conversation of what should we do now that Ukraine has fallen into the Russian orbit and our troops are still back in Missouri.
Well, Stephen Kotkin, the great Stalin scholar, great scholar of Russian history. By the way, have you two read his biography of Stalin, the 2 volumes with a third coming?
I've read parts of it. I cannot claim I've read everything.
They're long books, so you guys are busy, so it's okay. He said to the New Yorker recently, he agrees with Mr. Engel over here, the problem with their argument, referring to Kennan and Mearsheimer, is that it assumes that had NATO not expanded, Russia wouldn't be the same or very likely close to what it is today. What we have today, said Kotkin, in Russia is not some kind of surprise. It's not some kind of deviation from a historical pattern. Way before NATO existed in the 19th century, Russia looked like this. It had an autocrat, it had repression, it had militarism, it had suspicion of foreigners in the West. This is a Russia that we know, said Kotkin, and it's not a Russia that arrived yesterday or in the 1990s. I will close with this. My concern is 6 months or a year from now or 18 months from now, with thousands of more people dead, very little has changed in terms of territorial control. We'll be looking back at this moment wondering why Blinken and his counterparts in Russia were not pursuing negotiations more vigorously.
Sadly, I would not be surprised if we had that conversation.
I think that's probably true. I'm not sure we'll see some obvious missed opportunities. One of the things history teaches us as well is that these sorts of decisions and these patterns of behavior are very hard to work your way out of. And we can try to come up with abstract counterfactuals, but as you look at the context, it's very hard to see an easy way out. So I think 6 months from now, we'll still be in this war one way or another. Let's hope it hasn't escalated. And we'll be looking, hopefully, for diplomatic opportunities that arise then that are not there right now.
Maybe
Correct.
it is an ugly reality that the war is going to have to go on for some time more.
Sometimes wars are necessary to convince particularly overconfident attackers that they can't achieve their aims. Again, the United States has had to learn that lesson the hard way repeatedly in the last few decades.
Jeremi, Suri, Jeffrey Engel, thank you for challenging my ideas once more. And as mentioned, Andrew Bacevich, critic of U.S. imperialism and military interventionism, will be my guest in the next episode to continue this conversation. And if you have an idea for an episode, email me, mdicaro@washingtontimes.com. That is MDICARO@washingtontimes.com. And you can follow me on Twitter @MartinDicaro, my pinned tweet. You can sign up for my newsletter. You are listening to History as It Happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. A podcast from the Washington Times.